No, tweet it out now. Okay, I guess we are live. So sorry we're a little late. Richard just
That
had
was
to
my
get his
fault.
kid set up with Star Wars. So no, it was fair enough. But we're here. Um, put a W in the chat if you can see us and hear us. But yeah, I guess a lot of people might think that this stream is a little bit strange. You and I have not always been the best of friends. But I thought the last time we had what was supposed to be a debate, we had a pretty interesting conversation. So
Yeah.
I thought we could build upon that because I think recent events, but also just like the discourse broadly, the kind of problems faced, let's say, by this broadly speaking movement, the kind of conversation of where do you draw the boundaries between so-called Western identity and national identity, and what even is Western identity? This is a very confusing question. A lot of people have different things to propose. Whether you look at like the pagan Christian divide, or like the status of liberalism, race politics. There's so many different angles to this. So I thought we could kind of maybe try and work that question out in this conversation. Try and at least.
Well, let me say one thing. We
Mhm.
always got along just fine, but I think you got very angry at me when I did a terrible tweet that involved Star Wars. Of all this is just this coincidence. When you were, this is during the Stop the Steal. So I will formally apologize for.
Well, it's whatever. I mean, I get
being
into
a
arguments on the
teenager.
internet with everyone. Yeah, no,
But
it is
but
what
I've
it is.
never not gotten along with you in any other context. That was an intense time, a lot of intense emotions in 2020. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. But I guess like the first kind of subject I'd like to kind of get into, because I mean, I thought this conversation would be interesting precisely because you and I don't necessarily agree on a lot of issues. Is obviously the Russia-Ukraine thing. I don't want to get into the weeds on the Russia-Ukraine issue specifically that much because that's been done to death. But the Russia-Ukraine thing kind of brought out an interesting question for, let's say, the dissident right, which is, what attitude do we take towards the institutions and the logic that produces Western unity? Because you get this meme quite common in the dissident right of no more brother wars and this idea of, white racial unity. And obviously this is it brings itself over quite intensely in Australian and American nationalism, because our nationalisms kind of were built out of integrating different ethnicities of Europe into like these nation building projects. And now obviously we have the EU and things like this. So there's this attitude of, well, we kind of want to have this kind of unity. We kind of see the entire so-called West as having an essential civilizational identity, which we all share and which we want to preserve against hostile forces. But then at the same time, the institutions that supposedly represent this, like NATO and the EU and various other institutions, they seem to run directly against its interests. Supporting things like mass immigration and just like kind of the liberal definition of what is the West. The West is just individual rights. The West is just gay rights apparently now, and all these kinds of things. So how do we figure out exactly how to define this? Because I watched you had a debate with Haas. I've debated Haas before as well, once with Keith. Some of the guys watching might remember that. But you had a debate with Haas on the Ukraine-Russia issue. And, he was saying, so what is this European identity that you're referring to? Because you kind of put forward this idea of, Europe as a nation, the awakening of the kind of European nation and so forth through the kind of project of the EU. What defines it? And he was saying, what other than this, he called it like Reddit globalism or something, what really defines the West? Now, I think there's more to be said here than just like dismissing it the way he did. I mean, he has a more hostile view. But how do we work out this question? Because it is a very confusing question as to exactly how to define this at this point in history.
Well, okay, I'm going to say some things that I'm quite solid on, and then I'm going to put forward some bigger stuff that, to be honest, I myself am going through reading and I'm thinking about, and I'm not really positive on. So I'll kind of get some feedback from you and give your listeners a kind of very rough draft version of how I'm thinking about this. So I think in some ways the the dynamic or dilemma that you're discussing is between an ideal and a real one, in the sense that most nationalists of any kind, white nationalists, right, British nationalists, or whatever, if you say something like Europe a nation, or we're gonna bring back a kind of Charlemagne-like empire, or we're all one, we're in the same boat, you'll get a lot of nods and yeses and an affirmation with that. They think it in theory, and they feel like in the real world situation, we are all kind of in the same boat. Once you start bringing up any institution, be it the EU or NATO, etc., they start saying, "Oh, globo homo." They spread gay rights. They want to slap a rainbow flag on a U-2 bomber and go spy on the Ruskies or whatever, And I would say that we have to find some way in which the ideal and the real mix, because we aren't just going to kind of invent some Euro empire that we all agree on and which is super based and awesome and authoritarian or whatever. We're going to have to deal, if we want to accomplish anything, we're going to have to deal with the institutions that are at play right now. The EU is extremely powerful. It is a massive economic bloc that is affecting people's daily lives. When the EU makes a decision, say the one they made the other day on social media accountability and so on, that actually is going to directly affect people. So it's a very powerful one. NATO, which is an American-led organization, but certainly involves a tremendous amount of European nations. This is an organization that might have less of a cultural impact, but controls nuclear weapons. That is, they are playing the game at the highest possible level, and we aren't. And so at least what I'm suggesting is that some kind of crisis will bring about a more idealized form of that real existing European unity that is here and now, in the sense of when NATO lost its way due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a lot of highly dubious policies, such as humanitarian intervention in the Balkans, etc. Some kind of Middle East policy that seemed to just be entirely American-led. It lost its way. Might it kind of find its way? Might it actually stand for a united Europe and a united European people facing off against a clear major threat? Might it kind of be forced by world events to become based? Ditto with the EU. Might it kind of discover something about its identity precisely because it is engaged in a crisis? Now, so I'm offering a kind of hopeful realism in the sense that I'm not engaging in kind of mere idealism, like just imagining some, Charlemagne returns and the Holy Roman Empire is restored, or Napoleon comes out of the sky in a chariot. I'm not imagining that. That's mere fantasy. That might have some uses. We all have a fantasy life. But it's really not connected to reality. And so what I'm trying to do in my, cringe NATO and pro-EU posting is basically suggest a kind of hopeful realism that due to a crisis, these institutions, which are immensely powerful and are not going away, might discover something about it themselves, might discover an identity. And I would also say that our identity, however much it might delve in fantasy, like the notion that, of a united people and we're warriors and conquerors and all that kind of stuff, that is mere fantasy. That's mere Dungeons and Dragons or Luke Skywalker, unless it actually is based in a reality. That is, that in a crisis that we might actually become warriors and conquerors again. And we're not Marvel fans who, want to fly around and defeat Thanos. We actually understand that in a crisis, we're going to rediscover something about ourselves that we wouldn't discover otherwise. And so that's kind of, that's how I would understand it in terms of blending the ideal and real. And I have another whole thing I'd like to talk about, but if you'd like to respond to that, you can.
Yeah, well, I mean, to kind of like cycle back to like the obvious point, um, even if NATO and you know kind of current geopolitical events with the rise of like the Russian Chinese axis and like a Cold War 2.0, whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
this like new landscape. Does this really mean that there's an incentive with American or European elites to change their ideology to kind of look at what they're doing and say, well, we need to kind of turn around this birth rate issue. We need to sort out the issue of mass immigration so we can create, a more stable, and identity, basically, to build a majoritarian, democratic ethos around, or something like this. I don't see any evidence of this. In actuality, I see the opposite. I see them seeing, populism as like an enemy, and that's you can debate whose fault that is, because I mean your take I think would be more that, well, that's the fault of the right. The right is like defining itself against this Western unity, and
Yes.
the right in America is saying we don't care about Europe, and the right in Europe is saying we don't care about the EU, and trying to exit all of these institutions, and rip apart this framework. But at the same time, these institutions and this framework is directly hostile toward their interests. So you can kind of see it takes two to tango, and the solution would have to be someone coming to the realization that, look, if you want to solve right wing populism, you have to look at it's a symptom that is the consequence of mass immigration. And mass immigration is a consequence of basically minority subversion and feminism, reducing birth rates, and like trying to resolve these two issues, in tandem with, I guess, like the kind of post early 20th century ideological reconstruction of Western politics, where it had to define itself as basically being not fascist, or in the American context, not Confederate. Um, and so through through all of these mechanisms, which everyone kind of understands quite well if they're watching a video like this, um, they've come to the complete opposite. Where even suggesting this would be like ridiculous, and you get kicked out of polite society. It's not our fault, or it's not this process's fault for this. It's just the evil racists being racist, and there's nothing wrong with the society how it is. Actually, it's the greatest society that we've ever created, and we need to double down and triple down upon how libtard we can really be. Um, and so this is the problem I see, because
Just to reinforce, I
mm,
see I see both of those trends happening. So I remember there was some Julia Yaffe Twitter post on, it was I wish I could remember it, because it was like a parody basically, but I'll try to do it justice. It was something like, if Putin doesn't want you to gender transition your kindergartner, and so you are part of the effort in engaging in this stuff that most normal people find exceedingly toxic. So you can absolutely find that. You can find really some other countervailing forces among people. There was a lot of discussion during when the war began about reporters saying, "Well, all right, I'm gonna,
Richard
all right,
Jr.'s tearing
I'm
it
gonna,
up there.
Junior, okay, trying to invade
Oh,
the stream. All right, I'll just stand up like this. He deserves to not be on camera.
oh, there he
Yes.
is.
All right, just there you go. All right, I'm going to turn the camera off just for a little.
Yeah, maybe to
Okay.
sort that out, I'll take this opportunity to say, I forgot to mention it. If anyone wants to ask us a question after about an hour of this, we'll take some quick super chats. So entropystream.live/Joel Davis. You can leave a chat if you so wish. But I mean, I don't really want to kind of cut Richard off because you were trying to make a point. So I'll let you finish.
Yeah. Okay. There are also a lot of countervailing forces. There were all these journalists who were saying things like, well, I've seen really terrible wars and ethnic cleansing before, but not like this. This is like World War II. This is happening to white people. Effectively, they would say that. You have all of these incredibly hard, everyone used that word, countries like Finland and so on, now actively seeking to join a military alliance and understanding themselves as part of the team. There is much more talk of Germany rearming, something that would have been just completely unthinkable 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago, or even 1 year ago. I think there are a lot of, again, countervailing forces that might be kind of unconscious. I think it's too much to ask Europeans to say, why don't you go and start echoing the words of Joel and Richard? Or that's not going to happen. Maybe it will, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But it is reasonable to ask, can you begin to assert some kind of unified identity? Can you assert the fact that you're on the team of a military alliance that is directed against a real foe? And those things actually are happening to a large degree. And I can be absolutely proven wrong on this prediction. But I think a neo-Cold War, just by the nature of it, the fact that death is in the air and destruction, even annihilation is possible, is going to dampen a lot of the real toxic woke stuff. Now, obviously, that's stuff that, the train has left the station a long time ago. And these people for whom, their lives are made meaningful due to this are still among us, of course. But I think necessity is kind of is going to be the mother of a new identity that we ultimately want. So I actually do have a certain degree of hope for what's going to happen.
Well, I agree
but
with
I'll let
you
you
that
finish
this
and I'll
provides an
go on to
opportunity.
this other issue.
All right. Well, I agree with you that I see this as an opportunity to advance, basically more healthy, let's say, social ideas. And look, if we want to be a competitive civilization, we can't, we can't basically engage in this current ideology. It's a luxury ideology that you can't get away with. And I think the dissident right is making a mistake by only framing its ideas in terms of being against the system, against the elites, against constantly being this kind of I think the same thing you get with like the far left, where you're just like constantly just criticizing the system to the point where you're not actually proposing anything that any tangible political movement can engage in. You have to be, as you said before, realistic, and you have to, you're supposed to will the best for your society. If you have this kind of collapse fantasy where it's like you just want everything to be torn down so we can build something afresh, then you're not really able to participate in politics. So you have to put something forward that's functional and realistic. And my view is that there is an opportunity.
About these right wingers that they are willing they're embracing. I saw this thing from BAP on Twitter. Oh, I can't wait till Putin nukes Central and Eastern Europe. They deserve it for their disloyalty. Just this kind of death instinct. I think actually precisely as Freud described the death drive that you see manifest on all these far righters. I think it's a very unhealthy thing. It's a kind of notion of like, we feel so out of control in society, which is understandable. So the way to get back control is through this kind of apocalyptic fantasy. I think that is deeply unhealthy and says something.
It is a natural consequence. You can see why people feel like that, though, as you said. Like, it's a natural consequence of where we're at. We are in this decadent phase, and we are effectively committing suicide. Like, the left-wing version of suicide is, basically like a gradual demographic replacement, turning everyone into trannies. It's like a different kind of suicide, where it's the right is just saying, well, let's just have a cool suicide rather than this lame suicide, basically. right? And like a base suicide rather than a cringe suicide. It's like, okay, well how about something other than this?
That way, I tend to agree, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think this is something, though, that because the issue, I think, comes down to what liberalism fundamentally was supposed to be in its original phase, was grounded in, obviously, like, Enlightenment reason, in kind of, we can build a political discourse through adversarial reason, that we get all of these enlightened people to participate in civil society, and out of this process we can develop good ideas for the civilization. And if you want to propose something, you can, but then you have to kind of go to war within this kind of scientific discursive combat. And if you win out there, then your ideas can get institutionalized. And obviously, this is a somewhat ideal vision, but nevertheless, it was the concept of liberalism. Whereas now, we don't have that anymore. We don't really have anyone capable of engaging in civil society like this. Now, what we have is hysteria, basically. So I agree with you that we're entering into a situation in which there's an opportunity for an ideological reset. But I see the main thing holding it back is emotional thinking, and literally all of the disciplines, all of the social scientific disciplines, are all basically hysterical ideological forms. Like if obviously this is most extreme in things like with professional feminism, like women's studies type stuff, or critical race theory. But even it's the case with, even I would argue, like mainstream economics and things like this. So how do we really solve that? Because it's like, if we have a hysterical civilization, it's not going to be able to correct itself with reason. And that really seems to be like the crux of if you actually have a rational mindset, you can make a lot of obviously reasonable arguments about what needs to change, so we can actually get somewhere with better policies and so forth.
But I'm saying that it's going to be corrected through danger. I agree with you that, but don't you think kind of rational application of enlightenment, the Enlightenment to society? I mean, that was mostly a kind of gloss on what was actually happening. It wasn't like we all read Voltaire or something and then we decided to construct societies they were. I think there were much more underlying causes for all of these things, including the American and French Revolution and so on.
Yeah, of course.
So what I'm saying is not that we're going to win the argument. I mean, I think we should, obviously we're speaking rationally now. We should always put forward a legitimate, plausible scenario of what we want, of course. But what I really am saying is that people will change due to danger. That is the consciousness of death. That is actually going to affect them much more. And that, as you say, wokeism is in some ways a kind of like bankruptcy and end of the left. There's no Soviet Union out there or kind of utopia that can be accomplished. So it's like, let's just deconstruct the human being. And, the fact that they deal with pronouns is actually extremely significant. It really is deconstructing the ego itself, the I at the beginning of the subject of the sentence. And so in some ways, it's a kind of, total bankruptcy of the left and something that the left deal with. We can simply analyze. On another level, it is a purely just, luxury product that they are purchasing, basically. It's like a Gucci handbag or something. It's the idea that you're caring about, whether, homosexuals at your corporation are treated equally as heterosexuals, or that you can, rediscover who you are in your middle age, that you're in fact a woman or something. This is just the height of a luxurious society. Is way too comfortable. And so if anything is going to change it, I don't think it's the kind of, a rational perspective that you could bring to the table. But it will just be because we have to face death and danger. And that there's going to be a kind of cause. There's going to be a new cause that comes from the world and not merely from the application of rational ideas that will change us. And if the world, we have to be kind of like, we have to be the change you want to see in the world, as Obama said. Like, our ideology shouldn't, I guess I'm repeating myself here to a bit, but our ideology shouldn't be just kind of mere fantasy. Like we're noblemen and ladies and the true gentry of the world, and we're knights in shining armor. That's mere fantasy, and fantasy's good to a certain extent, but that's might as well be a Marvel fanboy if that's how you think. We need to be the kind of new person that's going to emerge from this crisis. That has to be what we want. That has to be our telos, because it would be based in reality. It's an ideal but it will be shot through with the real and so mixed that you can't tell them apart.
Okay, well, the issue that I see though, I don't think this can just happen automatically with like the current ruling class as it is in operation, because fundamentally what has occurred in basically from the 60s to now is what I call minority liberalism, in the sense that like original liberalism was basically based around, you know, the property rights, frankly, of white men. So it was
Right.
compatible with things like slavery and imperialism and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But then you get this inflection point, and obviously it wasn't like we flicked the switch and all of a sudden now it's just minority liberalism and all the individual liberalism stuff is gone. Obviously, these things don't work as clean as this, but the overarching tendency is kind of more and more minoritarianism and less individualism. And individualism has become like a conservative position that, you know, white people cling to say, please stop abusing the majority on behalf of the minority. It's a way for the majority to defend itself a little bit now, you know, like a Tucker Carlson type viewpoint from excesses of minority liberalism, let's say. And so
Right.
I think the only solution to this is something like majoritarianism, where you go, okay, well, we have a majoritarian identity, a collective identity, which we're going to act in the interest of. And the thing is that all these minorities that have ascended, all these, you know, they've gotten all these like social benefits that to kind of rise above meritocracy. Like, you know, Harvard is taking in all of these, you know, minorities and all these other big American, you know, academic institutions, corporate institutions. The new elite is increasingly dependent upon this minoritarian discourse. And so they're parasites. They don't care about ultimately the death of Western civilization because they don't identify with it. They are,
Right.
if Western civilization was healthy, they would be pushed back down where they belong. So obviously they're going to hang on for dear life. So who's going to push them down? They need to have a new kind of political consciousness in which they can actually engage in this, you know, structural conflict necessary to kind of, you know, reset the ship here. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get from you. Like, what does that look like? What is something viable or feasible in terms of like an ideological identity that can fill that breach? Because it seems like the so-called alt-right and the dissident right has proposed a whole bunch of things, and a lot of it is kind of not quite stuck. We haven't quite got like the mixture right yet. And that's kind of, I think, what I'm trying
Well,
to do is
I
figure
think
out how
the
to get that mixture right.
alt-right, you know, I think you're trying to press me to give you like one sentence answer, and I would say that we have to try to get closer to the answer through critique and analysis, because I don't have a ready answer. But I think the alt-right of yore was, and the Trump movement of 2016 was a kind of majoritarianism, if that's the right way of putting it. It was about the wall, stopping immigration. Trump in his RNC speech basically said, you know, look, I'm a rich guy. I know how to manipulate politicians. I also know that the system's rigged. Now I'm going to rig it on your behalf. So he was making a very different rhetorical promise or plea than, say, Ronald Reagan, who said, you know, oh, the system's rigged, it's corrupt. I'm going to reduce the system and you'll flourish as an individual. He's actually saying, I'm going to rig it on your behalf. It was absolutely a kind of majority rule type message. I think by 2020, Trump was offering something different. I think a lot of those threads were still there, but I think it was a fundamentally different message. It was a fundamentally more conservative message as well, post his healthcare bill, post QAnon, post COVID. It was a very different message. And the one we're going to see now, post the Roe v. Wade being overturned, is also going to be quite different. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that. I mean, I agree with you. I think what you're saying of a majoritarianism reminds me a bit of what Tim Francis was pushing for in the 1990s. And, you know, he was a brilliant guy. But I also feel like that, too, has been tried in a way and becomes increasingly non-viable as every day goes by. So I think, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a ready answer for this, but I might suggest that some kind of, we can't think through these questions outside of understanding our own minority status in this. and how are we going to have influence or just merely survive through that?
Yeah,
But
I agree with you that
keep this in mind. In Princeton, you mentioned Princeton had. I think these universities are actually not revealing their numbers now, but last year Princeton was already majority POC. And keep in mind that your local news channel or a big mainstream network, they're already in 2050 America or 2075 America. They've already created a certain post-white ruling class. And so all of these things that people are warning about, we better shut off immigration now, or who knows what might happen. Princeton might be majority POC at one point. All of these things have already occurred. And it's a typical conservative failing to warn about something that's happening. Fewer people might be going to church in the future. So, I mean, again, these things are baked into the cake at this point.
Okay, so then surely you need a radical solution then. Like, you need radical surgery here then. There's no like easy fix. So the reason I said majoritarianism, but I mean, what majoritarianism exactly means is not necessarily just like white people as a voting bloc. I mean, that's one way of looking at it, but obviously I think it's more complicated than this. So I think, like, what is patriotism? Like, patriotism ultimately is a kind of engaging with politics in the interest of the nation or in the interest of the society as such, as opposed to, basically personal or factional interest. So I think redefining, at least he's saying, look, if we want to have a democracy, that's the only way in which it can actually function. Like, you have to have the people engaging in politics actually acting in the collective interest. If everyone's acting in their own individual interests or group, like subgroup interests, then basically it just becomes, a race to the top for parasites who can kind of like take as much out of the system as they can get away with, and then what's left for the overarching ethos? Nothing much. That's what we see in the United States today. I think in particular, it's like a spoils system. So how do you break that? There has to be some kind of radical move, a radical reform agenda, that can actually break that if anything's going to be done. Otherwise, we might as well just give up. So I guess like we have to kind of start imagining, in my view, like that's like the kind of basic conditions. We have to start imagining, well, what is viable then? What could viably be an ideological justification for political figures, for a new class of statesmen, patriotic statesmen that could actually engage in a project like that? How would they sell it? What identity would they take? And I would say we have to come up with those answers in this live stream, but I think that's the kind of thing we need to be asking us. These are the kinds of questions that we need to have. That's why I wanted to talk to you, because you're coming at this from a complete different perspective than everybody else on the dissident right. So that's why I thought this conversation would be interesting, because you're going, and I don't necessarily agree with a lot of what you say, obviously, but you're kind of, I at least go, okay, well, this is a perspective I want to get, because you're saying, well, let's identify with all of these institutions that already exist, and then kind of imagine an alternative identity for them. And I think that's interesting as at least a thought
because
experiment.
They're so hollow. One of the things, I remember all of these disputes regarding the EU about what should be on the dollar bill. Should we put there? I remember reading articles about some like The Economist 20 years ago or so. Should we put Beethoven on the euro? Should we put Shakespeare? Oh, he's too English. Beethoven's too German, et cetera. It said they couldn't come, and so they ended up with like bridges and columns, architecture, this like very extremely neutral scenario. I think Beethoven's Ninth still does play a role in Euro patriotism, as it were. But I do think there's an institution with these, because they are hollow at the end of the day. The EU doesn't quite know what it is, but yet it is going to be around. It's going to exist. So there does seem to be a kind of opportunity to inject something into it that might, and particularly when your injection of meaning and identity into these shells is something that they almost need to face a crisis, and so that again, that's in some ways all I can offer in our small way, because remember, we don't have a tremendous amount of power. We have influence in limited ways. When I was at the peak of my own personal influence in the mainstream media, I will admit it was to a very large degree as a kind of curious boogeyman that people love to hate or hated to love or whatever. It wasn't really, I mean, I kind of change discourse to a certain degree. I think words like terms like ethno-state, or just saying, we are going to pursue identity politics. I think those were kind of new thoughts injected into the discourse, but I was mostly a curiosity, a boogeyman. So we have really limited influence. And so we need to think big, but have, a kind of realistic assessment of our prospects and our standing. And this does seem to be something that is somewhat possible, that in this kind of empty system that's just, that's liberal or just purely about deconstruction of previous identities, et cetera, might there be a kind of role for us to play?
Well, historically, obviously,
but is it realistic? Yeah.
But obviously, every idea historically started with a bunch of LARPers that had no influence and then eventually grew from there. So,
yeah.
I mean, obviously, we have to be somewhat narcissistic in the sense of, at least, like if you look at someone like Vladimir Lenin would introduce himself as like the future leader of the Russian Revolution over a decade before it actually happened. And he theorized revolution, and then he successfully completed it, and then became he got the job done. So, fake it till you make it, or then there's many other examples of this kind of thing in history. So I think the key is, like, if you want to have influence, if you don't already have influence, how do you get it? Well, I think the best possible way to get it is to come up with some really, really good ideas. And the advantage of the dissident right is that it's an epistemic community where you can have ideas that you can't have anywhere else. You get kicked out of every other community for experimenting with these kinds of ideas. And so it's like, well, love it or hate it, there's many like bad elements or toxic elements to the scene by the nature of it being a fringe scene. But at the same time, it's the space where you have to be if you want to be, on the cutting edge, if you want to be creating something new, because all the ideas that you could possibly have within the kind of purview of what the rest of the system will allow you to have, those ideas won't work, which is why we have crap ideas at the moment, because that's basically the limitations of the current norms. They've been extended to this. This is about, I mean, maybe you could be a conservative and try and like slightly modify it to make it more functional, but you're really not going to address any of the core problems. You're not allowed to address the core problems. So that's why I think, you have to kind of grit your teeth and just go with it, because there isn't really another alternative that I could see. And as you say, the situation is likely to get more and more dire if we're going to engage in civilizational conflict whilst carrying all of these luxury beliefs. Eventually, we're going to get some comeuppance for that. And so then there's going to be hopefully some openness to embracing some alternative ideas to, arrest a more desperate situation that we currently have. While America's in the unipolar moment, they're not going to be listening to the fringe for ideas. They're in the business of imposing their ideology unilaterally on the entire earth. If you're in that position, you're not listening to anyone for advice. But that's not the position that they're in anymore. So that means, okay, well then it's time to start building something new. And, obviously other people are doing the same thing, and you got to compete with those proposals. But I still think that this is, if you look at how consensus spreads, it always starts with a very small core. So if we can build that, that's really step one that anyone would have to take in the same position. And then you just go from there. So I think the question I'm trying to get at is not, is it possible? Isn't it possible? The question is more, what do you think are some key do's and don'ts? Like, what are some ideas that you think we've knocked out? These are kind of dead ends. And what do you think are like promising threads? I think that's maybe the best way to go with this.
I do think that, and I'll get to what I wanted to talk about in a little bit, but I'll do some do's and don'ts first. I think the kind of dumb isolationism is a real strong don't. And that can be somewhat effective in the short term, but I think ultimately kind of takes you out of the game. I remember hearing J.D. Vance, who just recently won the Republican primary in Ohio, although he had massive support from Peter Thiel and Donald Trump in doing so. But nevertheless, he did it. We'll say things like, the liberals want me to care more about Ukraine than I care about my mama. Well, I care about her. These just kind of non sequitur things. Like, actually, Ukraine does matter. It's just there are a bunch of NPCs obsessed with wearing masks, and now they have a Ukrainian flag. It's actually a really significant thing in geopolitics of Russia and the United States and Europe. It does matter. You should care about it. Your country is a founding member of NATO, whether you like it or not. You want to get out, or you just want to kind of not talk about it. And I just think this type of rhetoric might have a short-term good effect, perhaps, but it ultimately is just a kind of withdrawal from the game. You're retreating into borders and so on. We live in a society, we live on a planet, and we need to address that. We need to be engaged with the rest of the world. And these things do actually affect us. So I absolutely think that is a don't. I also think a lot of rhetoric on the right of kind of, we're going to kind of rescue white Christian America by, kicking out the illegal immigrants or, immigration reform. We just have to be realistic about what's happening. The demographic change is baked into the cake, and we're going to have to deal with that in some ways going forward. And even if you ignore the demographic that is widespread issue, as I was saying, 2050 exists right now at Princeton and Harvard, and increasingly on the Supreme Court and in Hollywood and so on. So the elites have already implemented this. And so you, at the very least, need to be aware of that. That's not just going to reverse because you put the illegals in halfway camps and get them out tomorrow morning, or even if you enact some of the immigration program we saw in Trump in his first year, kind of reducing immigration by half and so on. These major changes have already been implemented, and the demographic change is baked into the cake. You have to at least address this and recognize what it means. How can we live and thrive in a multiracial, multicultural society, which we are inevitably going to live in? Christians have an answer to that, to their credit. I do think that any, dissident right or whatever the hell you want to call me at this point, I was just a show. I was just like, I went out of the far right. I really don't want to be in that hamster wheel, but whatever you want to call me. We also have to address that. How are we going to live in this type of environment, which is going to happen? We aren't going to press reverse on the DVD player and we'll be back in 1980, 1950. It does not work that way. So how can we deal with this without basically saying, get off my lawn, get out of my country? There has to be a more nuanced and, in fact, realistic assessment of things than that, which is mere fantasy. So those are some don'ts. One thing to maybe push this maybe a bit in a different direction, I'll just talk about some of the concepts that I've been thinking through recently, particularly with regard to the Cold War 2.0 or the Cold War 1.0 and the kind of Russia-European divide. So there is I've been reading Mackinder and Schmidt again and I haven't, at least in my own mind, I haven't quite cracked this nut, but it is something I want to talk more about and write about. But where to start? There is a image in Job, the book of Job, Job 40, of Leviathan and Behemoth, as we say in American English. And these are mighty creatures. I think in common parlance, we usually use those as interchangeable, like we call, that football team as a real behemoth or something like that, or Leviathan state or something. Well, in Job, they actually are distinguished. The behemoth is a land animal. The Leviathan is a sea animal. And they are ultimately in conflict. They're the big honchos of their spheres. And Yahweh's message to Job is, you're afraid of Leviathan behemoth. What do I care? I'm above both. I could have both of those animals destroy one another, or I could destroy them. I am great. Who are you to contradict me? Were you there at the creation of it all? No, of course not. So that was Yahweh's message of being kind of a both, seeing Leviathan and Behemoth in a kind of Caducean battle, if you will. But I think it's important to think about who we are in the West, and I think those biblical images and as well as notions of geography can open up space for serious thinking about who we are. One thing I do take the side of the West in the current conflict, as I've made clear, and I've been certainly critical of Vladimir Putin, but I've never said that Putin is acting irrationally or sadistically or something like that. He is a madman who wants to go and genocide Ukraine for the hell of it. No, I think there are real, tangible, understandable, in fact, reasons why he feels like he has to bring back Ukraine. Now, some of these have been talked about in the mainstream are historical. The fact is, a lot of the independence of Ukraine was rather euphemistic in Soviet history, and there was as the Soviet Union was collapsing and the Yeltsin was becoming the president of the Russian Federation, there was a real issue of what to do with Ukraine, which had nuclear weapons in its environs, at least at that point, and how to deal with these problems, because it's not a real country, as I think many people thought, and some still think today. So there are some historical reasons for that, but I think the fundamental issue with Ukraine, putting aside history and putting aside that nuclear question, which is no longer relevant, might become relevant again, but is no longer relevant, is the geopolitical question, a geographic question. And that is the ability of the German army to cross through Ukraine, go all the way to the Caspian Sea, and effectively encircle Russia. Because there is very little access to the sea in the north. You're dealing with, frozen tundra and, basically. So, and obviously there is access all across the, Russian landmass to the Pacific. But this is a very different scenario than being in the West, which is to a large extent a sea power. France, Italy, obviously Great Britain, which is an island, all have access to oceans of various kinds and can travel and mobilize in that way. Whereas on the steppe, your ability, it creates a different type of mobilization. It creates mass mobilization across thousands of miles of plain and so on. But that also entails its own weakness, in the sense that Russia, as large and as powerful as it is, could be encircled if that kind of funnel point in Ukraine were captured by an enemy. So I think Leviathan versus Behemoth, with Russia standing as the kind of great land power and the West as a sea power, whether we think of ourselves like that or not, that is a geographic reality. These underlying forces have to play a part in how we understand our identity. Now, where exactly that leads, I don't quite know. As I've said, this is something that I don't think I had read Land and Sea by Schmitt a while ago. I don't think I had fully contemplated it and thought of it. I think the current Russia crisis kind of brought this to a fore. I had, encountered Mackinder a bit here and there. I didn't understand just how profound his ideas are. So this is something that, as I said, I'm kind of working through in my own mind right now, and I want to talk more about it and write about it. But I think it almost has to affect us, because these are things that this is who we are. And I think even going back deeper in history, what was Aryanism but an ability to be, of mass mobilization on the steppes, to travel long distances, on horseback. And obviously that, you can think of the Mongols and that as well. Anyway, these are, I apologize if some of this is kind of half baked, but that's how it is in my mind. But I think in thinking about like, what is unified Western identity? Who are we? We have to take these all important matters into account. And, again, this is something that I'm thinking through myself.
Okay, well, I mean, I think there's an issue with defining the West in that way, because what you're really doing is defining the Anglosphere. The Anglosphere, obviously, is a sea power, a sea empire, and that's why the Chinese are doing everything they can to build a blue water navy to try and compete with the United States to expel us from East Asia, because obviously you control the sea lanes, you control shipping, and I think there's actually a far greater likelihood that the United States and China go to war in the next couple of decades than the United States and Russia, because Russia's just too weak, really, to go to war with the United States. Like, if it actually went to war with the United States, we'd get crushed and be forced to nuke. It would just have absolutely no chance. It can barely. I mean, it's struggling in Ukraine, Yeah. So I don't really see that as being a viable conflict anytime soon. And when it comes to Europe itself, I mean, Germany is also a land power, just like the Russians. And I guess like the French were a kind of hybrid power, but the Germans were never really a hybrid power. They never really had a strong enough navy to compete, and that was obviously one of the big reasons why they lost the Second World War. So I think kind of projecting this kind of Anglo-spherical geopolitical identity on the West, I don't know if that necessarily flies, because the issue is that if the Anglosphere decides to take on the Chinese, is Europe going to be there backing up the Anglosphere? I don't think so. Maybe the French, but outside of the French, I don't think anyone else really has an interest or care or even the means to do anything. So we kind of have our own geographical reality, whereas when it comes to Europe, they're kind of like sandwiched between American and Russian power. And even though right now they're organized against the Russians, it is feasible to imagine a scenario in which that changes somewhere down the line. I mean, Russia's a very ambiguous state. You can make arguments to say that it's distinct from the West, but then you can make a lot of arguments to say that it's part of the West. So it's a very ambiguous thing. And even like, just with Ukraine,
doesn't that distinction arise from geography? And feel free to push back on me sometimes, when I first imbibe something.
But if the Soviet Union doesn't collapse, like the geographical limits of where Russia's sphere of influence is obviously quite different than it is now. And that's kind of arbitrary. Like, did the Soviet Union have to collapse necessarily, or did it collapse due to like contingent factors of mismanagement? I would say the second is probably more likely than the first. No one expected them to collapse.
I think it suffered a legitimacy crisis that is, it's a kind of, undoubtedly the system is unworkable in the long term, but I think it suffered a profound legitimacy crisis that really revealed itself. It reminds me of that line from The Sun Also Rises, or was it The Sun Also Rises? Yeah, Sun Also Rises, of, how did you go bankrupt? Well, gradually and then all at once. There's this weird element where, a East German bureaucrat, I forgot what exactly he said to a reporter who asked them, but he said, could we cross over to West Germany? He said something past aggressive, like, well, I don't know why not, or something like this. And, it was opening up the floodgates. I don't think the Soviet Union recognized its legitimacy crisis until it was far too late. And it did fall apart like a house of cards. When that was recognized, it was similar to, the emperor has no clothes is another good example. That is someone pointing out something where the kind of cloak of legitimacy just fades away, and you're some naked man in center of square getting laughed at. That was a lot like the Soviet experience. So again, what occurred is an interesting thing. I don't think it would have occurred due to its geographic necessity, in the sense that what the Soviet Union had going for it, and what still remains, is not just the residue of the Russian Empire, which is of course important, but just its existence as a countervailing land power vis-a-vis a sea power. And again, from a perspective, not necessarily Schmidt, because when Schmidt wrote Land and Sea, Germany was deep into the Second World War, and he was writing in many ways a hot polemic against the British, and kind of making excuses for Venice and saying, oh, they were kind of a sea power, but they recognized difference. Whereas, the British, these terrible people, have just given in to the sea, and that's all they are, this kind of global, encompassing power. Although there might be some truth to that. But, what the Soviet Union had going for was its kind of geographic legitimacy, its basis as a land power, as a countervailing force to a sea power. And I would stress that even with a place like Germany, there's a great deal of a sea component to it, and that's really what is going to distinguish it from Russia as a land power. But again, this is something, as I've acknowledged, I really need to do more thinking on this. Go ahead.
I mean, all states need access to the ocean, so all states need to be concerned with the oceans from a security perspective. But the question is one of means. And is China a sea power? I mean, historically, this would be a very incorrect thing to say, I think. But it is forced by necessity to become one, and it has the means to at least attempt it. So what is that about? I mean, that's just simply down to the fact that, well, they need to trade with other states, so they need sea lanes. Those sea lanes are controlled by the Americans, and the Americans want to impose a containment strategy on them in their region. So they're going to try and go against that. Now, with the Russians, do the Russians really want to dominate the oceans of Europe to expel the United States in the same way? Well, not really, because the majority of Europe, the part of Europe that they're interested in, is connected to it by land. So they don't really have this. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, the Russians would love to have a navy that could compete with the American Navy. Who wouldn't? But from a kind of security standpoint, I don't think that's really what they're concerned about. I think honestly, the Russians would have, in an ideal scenario, they would have loved to form an alliance with the Germans. They would have loved to have joined Europe in some capacity. I think that ultimately is in the Russian interest. What the kind of obstacle to that is the United States. I don't think the Germans have any natural obstacle to friendship with the Russians. Ultimately, I think, ultimately, I don't see any kind of natural geographical reason why in the kind of modern world. Okay, historically this was the case, but why in the modern world the Germans and the Russians would necessarily have to be enemies? Because the Russians have kind of been forced into an alliance with the Chinese by the permutations of their international rivalries. That isn't really ideal for them. They have a lot of kind of contested space with the Chinese. The Germans would be an ideal other partner, economic partner, that would, they basically have massive amounts of agricultural and natural resources. They would love to sell that to Germany instead of China.
Well, they have been doing that, but isn't it interesting that that became unthinkable at some point? And, going back to Bismarck, the, fear of fighting a two-front war and so on. I mean, it is a bit of a weird thing to say that there's no reason for Germany and Russia to be.
Well, no, the context is different today.
Theoretically, of course, historically, that's correct,
but there was a time though in history. But there was a time in history though where dominating Europe meant dominating the world, right? Where because of the Industrial Revolution, European powers just blew so far ahead. And even before the Industrial Revolution, European powers were at least kind of isolated from foreign influence largely. So they were kind of competing with each other to control their own zone of the world. And then they kind of like rose independently and their conflict became kind of globalized. but there was never great powers in other parts of the world that were really a major factor in European politics. Now there is. You have the United States, you have China, and other, the world in general is so much more in terms of relative power to Europe relevant, and the world is obviously more globalized. So I think I don't know, I think I'd say his name on YouTube, but like let's say the leader of Germany, the most famous leader of Germany in the mid 20th century, he kind of saw this. His view, I mean,
yes.
Yeah, his view was basically that the global geopolitics has changed, and he was trying to make this argument essentially to the conservatives in Britain, saying, you guys are opposing us, and you're reorganizing the entire international order to be to try and create a coalition against us. But this is actually against your interest, because you're allying with, basically you're creating a world which will be the Soviet Union versus the United States. That's what you're doing. You're not actually, the British Empire is gone if you do this. This is not in the interest of Europe, but Europe could be its own power, its own distinct power. Now, that obviously the ship sailed on that to a degree. That's a latent possibility. But if that was to become a possibility today, it's not the same thing, because instead of it being the United States versus the Soviet Union it doesn't exist anymore. Russia is far weaker. Now, the next big guys on the block are the Chinese, which were nowhere back in the 1940s. They didn't even have a coherent national, like fully centralized national government at that point. So, and the Soviet Union is Russia in relative power terms to the Soviet Union is just chalk and cheese. It's nowhere near what it was. And the Russians are struggling to reestablish, like a partial sphere of influence that's like analogous to like maybe half of the protectorates that they had in the Soviet Union, the height of the Soviet Union. So
they don't have the all-encompassing influence of ideology as well. I mean, I think they are attempting, because there is a way of understanding like Americanism or end of historyism or globalism, whatever you want to call it, as a kind of like the ultimate expression of sea power. It's soft power, of course, but it is a way to encompass everything. It's a way to, the ultimate encirclement of Russia would be to, sell them Coca-Cola and have Mikhail Gorbachev go to Pizza Hut. You know what I mean? It's not, it's obviously not a martial achievement, but it does have that same kind of maritime power of knowing no boundaries and enclosing everything.
But my point, though, is that like
the Soviet Union
Europe
had that.
But for Europe to develop independence today, which that would mean independence from the United States, and that would mean an alliance with the Russians. That's what it would mean. Europe would never be able to oppose. Europe would never oppose both. It would always like swing to one or the other. I think at this point, with the current global situation, obviously you don't know how technology changes it in the future. And so that means that I think this idea of defining Western civilization in terms of the sea power, land power distinction, it doesn't really make any sense, because these things are so contingent. The way that in different historical epochs, the balance of power and the kind of, the basically the way in which international politics makes sense, it changes through time. I think you have to base Western civilization, our concept of what it is, on something that is kind of continuous. So then you have to go back to things like, kind of Greco-Roman philosophy and culture and political culture and, Roman law, Greek metaphysics, Christianity, and actually like the white race. I think these are things that are kind of less ambiguously identifiable with Western civilization. Maybe Christianity is a bit more ambiguous, but these are the kinds of things that you need to appeal to, I think, to define who we are. And if you take those definitions, Russia's not really discluded from any of these definitions in a real tangible way, any more than anyone else's.
It is kind of funny that you're telling me this, Joel. But what, in terms of that's probably how I would have talked a few years ago if asked this question. And I acknowledge the East-West divide and so on. But yeah, genetically speaking, is a tremendous amount of crossover between Western Europeans, Central Europeans, and Slavs, Eastern Europeans, etc. So I agree. I get that. We have also, even from a kind of Nietzschean perspective, Christianity is uniting us all. I mean, from Nietzsche's perspective, Christianity is uniting us through that we're all facing this kind of nihilism crisis together. I could go on, but my question is, why did this land sea East-West divide emerge in just such a pronounced fashion? And why did immediately everyone take a side?
You talk about in the
There
context
was,
of Ukraine.
yes. Why is it
Well,
that Finland is not saying? I mean, look, I recently read an interesting book called One More Inch or Not One More Inch. It just got released by Yale, and it's kind of like diplomatic and insider history of NATO expansion. It's actually quite good. There were all of these weird scenarios going on of, I mean, that whole notion of not one more inch said by James Baker was said in the context actually of East Germany, and basically saying we might reunify Germany but maintain East Germany as a kind of shell of which there will be no NATO forces. So it was said in that context. I don't want to get on a hobby horse, right? I mean, to expand that and say now they promised NATO wouldn't expand is ridiculous. That was such a very precise context.
Well, I don't want to get bogged down in silly
but let me finish here.
Because I mean, if they promised it,
I don't want to either.
Yeah,
I agree. But let me finish here. I shouldn't have digressed. There were other points at which Poland wanted Russian nuclear weapons in Poland in order to guard against a resurgent Germany, which would just atavistically invade them. So we look at these things, we kind of laugh. There were serious diplomats who were suggesting these things at some point. Now, those were ultimately washed away, and all of the countries mentioned joined NATO, including a unified East and West Germany, and including Poland, etc. Why is it that the second, I mean, there was some ambiguity in 2014, 2004, there's ambiguity in the Ukraine crisis. Why is it that the moment a tank rolled into Ukraine, that everyone just immediately got in line? And we now have Finland seeking to join NATO. And France, there was no debate on what was going to happen. The Nord Stream plan was canceled immediately. Now, for some, it's not canceled soon enough, and Germany did a lot of damage, and they're dragging their feet. Fine, but there's really no prospect of a German-Russian analysis, a German-Russian alliance is just purely theoretical. Why is it that these things just snapped back into place? Is it just pure kind of momentum of the 20th century? Maybe there's probably a lot of truth to it, but maybe there's actually something deeper that's leading to this.
Well, I think specifically, why is the Ukraine situation what it is? I mean, in my view, Ukraine's borders were badly drawn because basically you had a situation where there's a political division in the country that is geographic. Now, if you look at the United States, you don't have all the red states on one side and all the blue states on the other. If you had that, the likelihood of a civil war would be much higher than if they're kind of like mixed around, right? But obviously that's not the case.
That's a good point, yeah.
That's not the case in Ukraine. And so the solution to this was some kind of federalization where they could have some regional autonomy. They tried this with Minsk. That's what the Germans and the French were trying to negotiate. They wanted stability in Europe. And this process, you can point your fingers at whose fault it is, but ultimately all that matters is that it failed. That's really all that, at the end of the day, that's all that matters. And so if it fails, the only solution is a military solution because politics has essentially failed. Now, I think it was in the United States' interest for it to fail, precisely because they could force the other Europeans to pick a team. And that's what they wanted. So I think the United States were pushing for it to fail and they got what they wanted. Now, people say, but there were Ukrainians that really, they wanted to pursue Ukrainian nationalism. They were hostile to the Russians. They wanted integration with the EU. All this stuff is true as well. Obviously, there are Ukrainian liberals and pro-EU Ukrainians. And the Americans didn't just like manufacture that out of their ass. Nevertheless, this is the situation in Ukraine. It's kind of, you could look at it in a sense as kind of a tragedy that basically the nation never had a chance because it was just like placed in this awkward position where there were these political forces that were never going to allow it to stably develop. And now it's a mess. What comes out of this war obviously will depend upon, who wins militarily, but ultimately there will be a reestablishment, I think, of a border. And then I think all the pro-Russian people will kind of go over one side of the border and the pro-Ukrainian people will go over the other side of the border. And then there'll probably be whatever remains of Ukraine will be a far more stable nation state going forward.
I agree with
and
that. I think a division of Ukraine is almost inevitable, and even seen mainstream commentators talking about this. Where exactly, like Odessa and Crimea, like how exactly the border will be drawn and its effect in
it
terms
can only
of
be
sea
decided on the
access.
battlefield.
It's going to be interesting. Yeah, it's interesting,
Yeah.
and it's very messy. But I think it's very clear that these early notions of a knockout blow to Kiev and just a march in, put Zelensky in a show trial and denazify everyone and start and just take back all of Ukraine. That's over. That's not happening.
Now,
And
what we're seeing
the
coming out of
division of
Europe, though,
Ukraine.
what we're seeing coming out
Go
of
ahead.
Europe, though, is that whatever remains of Ukraine, that's going to become part of the EU, like almost
Yeah.
dead certain. Like this, it's
And
already
NATO,
basically they're trying to
honestly.
get they're trying to get the papers signed to do it before the war's even over to figure out what even remains of Ukraine. And as for like Finland and Sweden, they're already part of the EU, so they kind of already picked a team. Now,
Yeah.
so from the perspective of the EU bureaucracy, because you got to understand that. I mean, you understand this, and I think most people do. But in European politics, you have the EU bureaucrats, a lot of them who have this idea of basically increased centralization of the EU's power. Basically making the EU Parliament, more powerful, more involved in the decision-making process, and basically, getting an EU military set up, and like basically taking steps towards the United States of Europe as a something almost like a nation state, at least like advancing the ball in that direction. Obviously, you're not going to
Yeah.
go from 0 to 100 immediately, and they're seeing this as a great opportunity. They're already, putting proposals. I was reading some news articles in Politico, but no one's talking about them, surprisingly, about a whole bunch of these proposals being put forward in the EU as we speak to build an EU military and all this stuff that no one would have thought was possible 2 years ago. So this is really advantageous to them, and so that's kind of why I think Europe chose a side, because I think that those forces within European politics, they see this as an opportunity to get what they want. And I think they're kind of behind it. Whereas German industry is like pissed off about Nord Stream 2 being cancelled, is pissed off about sanctions on Russia because it's against their business interests. So it isn't as though like all of Europe is politically aligned behind this. It's just that there's like an elite managerial strata that can get what it wants out of this. And so I think that's the best way of explaining it, is that they're just kind of pursuing their self-interest opportunistically. I don't think it's like some like deep-seated Western civilizational unity that's really kind of pushing any of this. I think it's just like strategy and I mean, I think in the sense of like European unification, this is a force that is definitely that's a bigger idea. That goes back to Napoleon. You could argue it goes back to the Roman Empire, however you want to talk about it. You could say that force is realizing itself here, but I don't think that necessarily had to disclude Russia necessarily. It kind of just worked out that way because of just the contingencies of history and how the 20th century washed out, basically.
Yeah, I don't disagree with a lot of what you said. I think my story is a bit more compelling. That there actually is an underlying force that is occurring, and that these, a German-Russian alliance is merely theoretical and could occur to some degree, but is going to kind of slam up against this reality at some point. It's the point. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to go back to Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the Russian Empire, and you kind of saw a similar force, because there's one of the fascinating things about Cold War 2.0, if we are to say that is occurring, is that the sides have been flipped and the ideologies in a way have been flipped. So in the Cold War 1.0, there was a notion of the Soviet Union as just the ultimate progressive force. It was just going to sweep across Europe. And it was, Stalin, one of the reasons why he was fairly generous, you could say, with Germany, just taking a third of it for the Soviets, was that he thought that, it was only a matter of time before these capitalist powers are at each other's throats, infighting, collapsing. They're going to be demanding communism in London. in a few months, and we can just kind of, we did the fighting and dying in the Eastern Front, but we can just kind of sit back and let it happen. No one thinks like this anymore in Russia, and even even post New Left, and when the Soviet Union wasn't quite the vanguard force that it once was, it was still generally supporting the left, and the left in the United States would run cover for it, and it would support the left in its most toxic forms, like that army faction, probably the best example, which was supported even through the 1980s by a fellow named Vladimir Putin, by the way, who was stationed as president. But what's happened now with Cold War 2.0 is you have this reversal. And so you have all of this sympathy towards Russia and kind of running cover for Russia by what are reactionary forces. So you have some America First type people saying, well, Putin actually cares about his people, and he's a Christian, and he's trying to, keep his people away from degeneracy. And it is basically right-wing forces that are backing Russia. And, a figure like Haz is, you might probably agree. I mean, he's, I guess, a communist to some degree, but this is just clearly a reactionary Christian conservative that I was speaking to. I mean, to call him a Marxist or progressive seems bizarre. So these things have kind of flipped. And, Putin is a stand-in for tradition. And the United States, which was kind of on the right in the Cold War scenario, is now a force of universalism and standardization and gay rights and blah, blah, blah. Very similar to the situation with the Tsar and Napoleon's invasion of Russia. He was a stand-in for an embodiment of, the French Revolution and a new uniform system that had swept through the old Holy Roman Empire, kicked it to the curb, and was now facing off against this reactionary force in Russia. I think we're actually kind of returning to a scenario like that, which I find
I've got an interesting talking point about that, though, because obviously what we have now was crafted at the end of the Cold War, in a sense, ideologically. And the West crafted it as a way of outpositioning the Soviets on the left. They wanted to have a Western left that had nothing to do with the Soviet Union, so-called New Left, right? Now you're saying, okay, so now it's flipped, and the left is not being kind of, there's no allure on the left of like China and Russia. The allure is on the right. So the question is, does the West want to outposition the right in this kind of like pro-China, pro-Russian right by creating one that supports itself? And then could that then become the new ideology in the future? Now, that's the kind of thing I'm interested in, like in exploring, because it's like, well, what do you want to have? Do you want to have the entire right wing against, like being right-wing populists that are just against the system and are constantly dragging you down? Or do you want to have a right that you can actually work with, a kind of like a nationalist right that is, that supports Western civilization? I think there's like a market for this.
I totally agree with you. And this is kind of my own selfish calculation on some level. Yes. I do think they're going to want to do that. I hadn't fully thought of that. I think Paul Gottfried might have made comments to this effect in his book, The Strange Death of Marxism, which I haven't read for a while. But what his point was that was kind of twofold. First off, that if you talk to a member of the Communist Party in Paris in 1960 and you said, "Oh, well, you must support gay rights and abortion on demand and free porn," or whatever, he would just punch you in the face. I mean, from the perspective of that commie, it was about
bourgeois
better
morality.
Working condition. It was about bourgeois morality on some level. I agree, but it was understandably so.
No. I'm saying they would have seen like the LGBT thing as like bourgeois morality that distracts us from the struggle.
You even saw that in the Soviet Union to a degree, with their understanding of homosexuality, as well as some kind of excretion of advanced capitalism, which might not be completely wrong, but Yeah, and so you had this new left, even kind of a new Marxianism, which was pointing towards Washington as opposed to pointing towards Moscow. And I think that actually played a probably a decisive role, in fact, in the legitimacy crisis that the Soviet Union experienced, which I was mentioned before. You now have this situation where populism has, at least from my standpoint, just kind of taken itself out of the game. If you're going to just avidly defend the invasion of Russia while living in the United States or while living in Western Europe, I mean, at the very least, you could say it's bad optics. You are taking a side against your country, and you're taking a side that is going to be difficult to defend, at least from my perspective. So might the West want, if it can't deal with populism, and if it views populism just so emotional and reactionary that it leads to like January 6th over and over again, and QAnon and notions that the
That isn't really
government is
stuff to
evil
be
and lying
afraid
to
of,
you.
though. What they should be afraid of is
Fair
like
enough. Fair enough.
when the Soviet Union breaks up, what does it break up into? A series of nationalisms. That's what they should be afraid of.
From what I got from this book on NATO expansion was also the fear was, the he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, in the sense of what would happen if you had a hardline right, even if it was cloaked in communism, taking over in Russia. We simply cannot allow that to happen. We can deal with someone like Boris Yeltsin. We absolutely can't deal with someone who's going to, want to pursue a revenge policy on the West or so on. So I don't know. I think there is. I think populism, we've seen its moment, and we've seen all that it can lead to. On some level, it leads to, it leads to Charlottesville, it leads to January 6th, it leads to QAnon, it leads to it leads to Marjorie Taylor Greene in Congress. I mean, it leads to all sorts of nonsense, which I agree with you that it's, maybe not a huge threat, but it is kind of destabilizing and unpleasant, add to the legitimacy of the state. Might there be a kind of opening for a right which is going to oppose, globo homo, obviously, but it does understand itself as on Team West? And I do think there's an opening for that, if they would allow it. They might view someone like me as just so inherently toxic they wouldn't want to ever deal with me. But at least I think there is a kind of opening there. There's a legitimate space where you can legitimately say this and work within the system and be loyal to the system, and while being a kind of loyal opposition.
Loyal to the system, because I think you would have to be like, okay, we need to radically change the system because it's not functioning correctly. Like, you can't just say loyal to the system. I think you could say loyal to the nations of the West, the Western civilization and its structural interests. But to say to be loyal to the system means you're kind of like tying yourself up with loyalty to bad leadership, which is actually against the interest.
I get that.
Yeah,
I get that, but it's something that can be nuanced. It means not wishing an apocalypse upon your country. Just let it all burn so that we can, out of the ashes, something new will arise. It's a kind of realistic assessment that these institutions are real, they are powerful. I of course agree that in terms of incompetence and in terms of, global homo or anti-white animus. And so I of course agree with that. But I guess as I get older, maybe in my 20s, I might have been someone who was a kind of let it all burn, just, Joker, pouring gasoline on a big pile of money or something. But as I get older, I see the limits of that kind of view. I do view that attitude as childish.
Yeah, obviously you need to have a positive vision. You need to basically go, okay, well, if we want to have a healthy civilization, these are the core principles it needs to have. And then you defend yourself by saying that you're actually defending society. You're actually defending the good. And that's actually, I think, morally, that's very morally compelling. Oh, these people are actually advancing a more moral view than their enemies, who are hysterical, who have like all these inconsistencies in their view. And I think that's how you kind of build influence in a way that people are actually willing to kind of give resources and their time and effort to advancing that kind of politics. I think you need to be principled, and that view of just collapse fantasy. Obviously, that's so unprincipled that it just is tantamount to nothing but just like letting off some steam, basically, like just being kind of pissed off. But I wanted to get to some of these super chats because I know you got to go soon, if that's okay. There's only a few questions. So the first question is from Norm Kelly, who asks, "Do Anglos have a distinct identity and destiny from other Europeans?" What do you think about that? I mean, you're an Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I am, but I'm Anglo-Saxon and Saxon. My mother's maiden name is Dickenhorst, and believe it or not, my grandfather
could have been Dick Dickenhorst.
You jumped in before I said it. He was literally named Dickenhorst.
Based.
Yes. I love that, man. It's a cool name. Yeah. My father was like, "Oh, I'm sure my new wife is so happy to be called Spencer." It just rolls off the tongue or something like that. But I don't know. Maybe I'm a little bit partial to being called Dick Dickenhorst. It's pretty badass. Yeah. But no, so I have Central German blood, and then I obviously have English blood with my last name, and I'm proud of it. Yeah, I guess it's a good question. I obviously think there's a kind of Anglo identity which is different from a French identity or a Central European identity, and certainly a Russian identity. But I guess what and Joel kind of brought this out from me. I guess what I'm stressing now that I'm thinking through this geographically is that there is a broader Western identity as opposed to a Eastern or Russian identity that of which Anglo-Saxonism is a part. So I do see the Anglosphere is kind of part of a broader Western.
Obviously, we're part of the West, but from a geographical standpoint, we aren't part of Europe as a continental landmass, and so that imposes a different, from a structural realist perspective, that imposes different incentives. It's now I think if we're going to take on a Russia-China alliance, then it would make sense for obviously them to be an Anglosphere and Europe to be aligned. But as I said, Europe is not going to be helping us. It's just us in East Asia. They're just not. It's just going to be Japan, Australia, America, maybe Britain and France. France maybe, but only Britain really is definitely going to help in containing China. So Europe doesn't really care about that. So I think that means that there's going to be, if you just look at it if you're going to base everything in geography, you have to acknowledge that there's these like two Wests essentially.
Yeah, I'll leave it there. I kind of addressed that earlier. I disagree a little bit, but
I think one interesting thing about Anglo-Saxon identity, I mean, English is becoming the lingua franca, so to speak, in Europe. So, I mean, this is not necessarily, this goes with your point, but I think English, by the fact that English is a hybrid language between like a kind of Germanic language and a Latin language, means that the way that Anglos think is in a sense a kind of a more hybrid version of like the European, all of Europe essentially, all of Europe's cultural perspectives, which I think is a big reason why in the 20th century the Anglosphere.
Sorry, I have my duties. I'm being called. Oh, well, let's do a 5. We'll try to get through the super chats, but keep going. I don't want to.
Okay. All right. So, what was I saying? Yeah, because English is this hybrid language, I think it puts English speakers in a perspective where they're kind of able to think like all Europeans. A kind of like a kind of synthetic European way of thinking emerges from it, and so this, I think, positions Anglo culture to be a kind of mixing ground. And in the same sense that all these immigrants come from Europe, originally a lot came into Britain actually, but then a lot of immigrants from continental Europe obviously came into the United States and Australia. So in a sense, the Anglosphere is kind of like a synthetic admixture of Europe in a lot of ways, whether it's language.
I agree. Let me ask you a quick question. Do you think consciousness is fundamentally linguistic?
I wouldn't say fundamentally,
consciousness in the sense of an ego and inner narration and just
I think it's fundamentally, it's linguistically mediated. Like if you didn't have any language at all, I don't think you could really develop anything like an ego.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, I probably wouldn't have said this earlier, but I totally agree. And your discussion of the English language was quite beautiful in the sense that, you know, what is Shakespeare, but it's a, post French speaking Viking invasion that is, that's turned into this modern English, which brings in a great deal of French and thus Latin and thus Rome, but is also kind of fundamentally Germanic, structurally Germanic as well. I think maybe that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I noticed a lot.
There's a lot of anti-English sentiments, it's this petty nationalism of, stop. I hate it that people are, my children are learning English and, it's just about cheeseburgers and Coca-Cola or whatever. I think it's, I think it's much better to see.
Yeah, I would say the Anglo is the true synthetic European. We are more European than anyone else.
Hail us.
Anyway,
yes.
Another super chat from Serena says, conquering and expanding territory seems to be part of the human spirit. Do you think that's a problem when nuclear weapons prevent people's doing what's part of their nature? Great discussion. Thanks, Richard and Joel. What do you think about
that? That's a really profound question. And I agree. I mean, I think you could make a case that with when was it 1948 when the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons, or 1949 around then, that was also a kind of end of history in itself, in which we could only fight these proxy wars or kind of partisan wars that we would manipulate behind the scenes, and that a real conflict had become just totally untenable because it would bring about utter global catastrophe beyond anyone's control, at least potentially. I think we very well might see a kind of limited use of nuclear weapons in our lifetime. And I for better and for worse, mostly for worse. But yeah, I think that's actually a really profound point that, war itself, that for better and for worse, is a real thing. Conflict is natural. Conflict in a way can bring about stability. And lack of conflict brings about decadence and self-deconstruction. That we've lost that in the age of these terrifying weapons. I think that's a very profound point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a bit of a meme though to say that like nuclear weapons are like preventing conflict from occurring, because there's only two states in the world that could have mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons, and that's Russia and the United States.
Right.
Russia could go to, the Americans could go to war with the Chinese, for example, say over Taiwan, and China would have no incentive to nuke the continental United States or anything, because they would get tenfold that many nukes back. And the nuclear defense shields in the United States would probably be able to knock out most of those ICBMs, and then China would be wiped out into a bunch of craters. So why would they launch that? They would rather just take the L on Taiwan if they were losing for whatever reason, and just hold, and the Americans don't really have the capacity to invade continental China. So it would just be like a status quo maintenance kind of scenario. You have nuclear weapons on both sides in India and Pakistan, but they still fight against each other in the Kashmir and so forth. Like, even though they have nuclear weapons, it doesn't stop them contesting space. And obviously the Russians are still in Ukraine, and the Americans intervened as much as they could, but all it did was just kind of keep them from we care about Ukraine, but we don't care enough to like raise the stakes to mutual nuclear annihilation. So there's still like all these spaces where real wars can occur in the world, and nuclear weapons obviously complicate that picture, but they don't completely remove that picture. So I don't know. I think it's more the case of globalization had this effect, where you just had the United States and its world order became so powerful that just there was no other possibility within the Western world for any kind of internal Western warfare to occur. And that only got exacerbated by the way the end of the Cold War was handled, which was pretty successful from a strategic standpoint in the 90s.
The total encirclement that the end of history it expresses, the encirclement of even your dreams, to say. I really wish I could stay longer. I'm going to have to run, but
that's okay. But it was a good chat. Thanks for coming on.
I think this is a great conversation, and I would absolutely say this. I'll try to schedule one in which I'm not wrangling kids, but okay. Anytime.
Thanks for making the effort anyway. I mean,
oh yeah, I gained a lot from talking to you, so I would absolutely come back anytime. I really look forward to it, in fact.
All right. Well, thanks, dude. Have a good day.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
talk to you soon, Joel.
Yeah.
Bye.
I'll just finish these super chats after now Richard has left. Actually, there's only one more, so I'll just take this myself. Catch 22 says, do you consider the Jewish strategy of a minority elite, Zionist-like movement viable for the West? Perhaps not soon, but sometime once biopolitical categories are made from failed race integration. I mean, I don't think the thing is with, let's say, I don't want to keep using the phrase because I think I don't know how much I've already kind of insulted the YouTube algorithm with this stream, but let's say with the kind of identity that Jewish people developed in their kind of relative position to Europe as a kind of distinct people within Christendom for thousands of years, this selected for traits that could essentially survive as a kind of minority very successfully. There would have been a lot of people who were Jewish who, basically abdicated Judaism, married a Christian, and converted to Christianity, and then their children would have just been kind of absorbed into the wider European genome as just another like I think this would probably have occurred for quite a lot of them from the time of Christ till now, and what you're seeing with the the decline essentially of religion in general in the West, but Judaism in particular, is the genetic absorption of Jewish people into the West. I mean, they kind of outbreed more than almost anyone else. And so this situation, engenders itself essentially to, I think, like, Zionism uniquely, because the people that still retain that sense of Jewish identity, they basically need a kind of nation building project to kind of reorganize their identity around in the secular world. Now, the situation that we face is very different, where we don't really have this like other place that we were mythologically or like actually from, thousands of years ago, and this kind of we don't have this project of rediscovering our ancient lands. I mean, obviously some of us live in the Anglosphere, the kind of colonial holdings in a diaspora, but it's kind of like a majoritarian diaspora. So I don't know. But other than that, obviously, you still live in continental Europe. You're in your homeland, so there's nowhere for you to go to kind of recraft, to create the white Zion or whatever. So unless something like that was created, which I guess in a sense, that was what the Australian project in a sense was. It was like, okay, we're going to have this European country here on this island, and we're going to like purposefully create a European country here, even though we're not in Europe. And obviously the United States was kind of like this as well. But something like that, if you created something like this and then you had mass defection from other European states, and then over time that developed where like people would kind of agitate for certain policies, you could see something like that forming, but it just doesn't seem to really make sense from our perspective. So I don't really think so. I think we'd kind of be on our own. I don't think that this is actually an interesting question, because it gets into the European mind and what makes Europeans unique, or Westerners unique, or white people unique, which is that if you go all the way back to Solon's reforms in ancient Greece, 550 BC, I got this from some interesting conversations with Dr. Ricardo Duchesne, and the institution essentially of monogamy and the prohibition against cousin marriage, as I said, 550 BC, this basically was done to break up the kind of ruling dominant clans of Athenian society, to create a democracy essentially where citizens would have more equitable economic relations, and therefore they could kind of participate in politics on a relatively equal footing. And this ultimately produced in the coming centuries, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and basically this concept of basing our ethics in metaphysics and trying to base our politics in this kind of rational inquiry into the good, and civil society as such, as opposed to just having clannish loyalties and then like jostling between rival kinship groups for influence, which is basically the default setting of humanity. We're biologically programmed to, form kin groups and then essentially defend their interests with like a kind of two-stroke morality. Only Europeans have come to take this view, where instead of simply just aligning with our kin, we have this idea of abstract, rational principles as being the guiding, ethical fact by which we organize the world and organize society and our lives. And if you have, like, for example, Pakistani immigrants into the United Kingdom, or obviously the tribe that we just discussed, where they have basically tighter breeding structures. They haven't gone through 2,500 years of marrying out from clans and all these like processes of breaking up clannish loyalties and creating instead kind of like civil society where you have national loyalty that's kind of a bit more abstract, between a kind of outbred larger group with more genetic diversity and like nuclear families and such. You don't have that same kind of instinctual loyalty to your kin in the way that, and so it makes sense that we would be liable to multicultural ideas in the West as a result of this legacy. And it isn't a simple fix. In order for Westerners to essentially look out for their own, racial interests or kin interests, it has to come in the form of a rational ideology. It has to come in the form of as I said, it has to come through a kind of universal principle of some sort of like, well, we should have our own nations because other people groups have their own nations, and it's fair for us to have our own. And these other groups come into our countries, they work against our interests, they work in their own self-interest, they can't really be functional members of our civil society because they don't play by the same rules as us. You have to make these kinds of arguments. And if you go back to the beginning of the so-called alt-right, these were the things that were the so-called red pills that really got people going. At least for me, that was my experience. It was like, reading statistics around race and IQ, reading statistics around race and crime stats, and getting into, basically these taboo areas of science, race realism, and obviously it's associated with like sexual politics, gender politics as well. But it was kind of like by becoming aware of all of these facts, it demonstrated that this this universalist ideology of individualism, we just treat everyone according to these universal principles, and it doesn't really matter whether they're a man or a woman or what race they come from. That this is untenable. That this is actually a fabrication, a generation of Western culture that doesn't have analogous transference. Now, it's possible, obviously, for people from other racial backgrounds to kind of become socialized into it through time. But nevertheless, like as a general trend, they don't play by the same rules. They kind of, you see this with, obviously with African Americans, they vote according to their racial identity, very explicitly. Obviously, there's a complex history there that kind of defines that. Whereas, whites only just barely, if you kind of describe the Republican Party as in their interests, they're the most kind of like split voter group in the United States. And there's been mass support for things like mass immigration and so forth at this point. So how is all of this possible? There has to be something about us that makes this possible. So I think in light of that, to fabricate a solution, you have to kind of take Westerners for what they are. We're not going to all just start marrying our second cousins and rebuilding like these clan groups, and like the ship has sailed on that. Like we live in modern technological societies. You need nation states to survive, and so instead, I think you need to have a political ideology that kind of rationally justifies the defense of majoritarian interests. I think that's the only way to go about it. We're not going to be able to act like parasites on a host civilization. We're not going to be able to play the same games that other ethnic groups play because we're just not like them. And this idea, even just this idea of like what should our strategy be as a people? This is a very Western idea. None of the other races are kind of like critically self-analyzing their ethno-political strategy. They're just kind of running upon instinct. and just kind of going with their nature. Um, with us, it's kind of like we have to check the excesses of our own nature, which it is basically both the problem and the solution, because there are ways of arguing in the framework of, I think, moral universalism and kind of rational ethics for our interests. So there's a way of, because this has been done in Western history. We know this for a fact. You know, we saw the creation of ethno-states in places like Australia, my home country. Um, based in these rational principles. There wasn't just some default setting of us just doing what white people do. It was a very conscious process of nation building, and that's kind of what we need. Europeans need to have a kind of a conscious like civilizational project that's ideologically delineated, that they believe in and are convinced by, and that's how we operate our societies, and it's not going to change. That's just part of our nature. But this is a subject I'd like to go in more in a different video, or just later in general. It's a very big subject, but yeah. So that's it for the super chats. It wasn't that many, so thankfully, so I don't have to keep doing the stream. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I know a lot of you don't like Richard Spencer, and I get it. But I thought it was an interesting enough conversation, and ultimately, it's good to get different perspectives, let's say, on these issues, because I think often you kind of get locked into these ideological camps of only thinking about things one way, and this can basically prevent us from maybe critically self-examining in the way that we need to. Clearly, we don't necessarily have everything worked out in this movement. There's so much diversity of opinion, and it hasn't been any successful application of the ideas, and so we're still in a phase where the solution isn't obvious. Now, people say, "Oh, we can't just like constantly engage and just critique layered upon critique. It's debilitating." And I agree with this. Ultimately, there has to be some kind of decision. You have to kind of hitch your wagon to a particular strategy and leadership. But we're not really there where that is super obvious at this point. So we need to kind of engage in this kind of discourse in order to kind of get there, I think. So anyway, with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.